Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case, and Brad here, and potentially you guys
don't know a damn thing about it.
So, welcome back after last week's very amazing, emotionally charged episode. We're recording this like the day after that episode posted, so we don't know the full extent of your guys' thoughts. But so far, a lot of you have commented and sent us messages, and a lot of it was like I predicted in the episode, which was, I'm crying on my way to work, or I started crying on my walk this evening. And and for good reason. It was a really good episode. It was really well told on Brad's part. And like I said, and like several of you said, he just keeps getting better. And yeah, I think last week was his best episode. So definitely check that out if you want to cry.
I appreciate the feedback, guys. And I'm actually getting a little teared up now. Just must be that time. But thinking about the case, thinking about Charlie Howard and everything that he went through. And then, just happy that you guys seem to enjoy it. So hopefully I'm getting better. And like I said, hopefully it goes from, it's a Brad episode to, it's a Brad episode. So.
And I think it is just that time because I've also been really emotional lately and really I've felt the need to cry. And it's one of those things where it's like, I'm not sad or depressed about anything. Sometimes you just need a good cry. And I think last week's episode will give you that good cry if you need it, because it was really good. It was just really well told. And again, thank you, Brad. I don't have anything to add, but
he's completely wrong, because this week we're heading to Cabin Con, which is a huge thing for us.
Yeah, we are heading to Cabin Con this weekend.
Which is our made-up convention that we and our friends made up during COVID. We couldn't go to Dragon Con, so we all went and got COVID tests and rented out a big house on the lake and all hung out with each other during that time. We did get tested before anybody says anything, but Dragon Con started back up. We were like, wow, Cabin Con was really fun, and so now we're on what? Year 5, I guess.
This will be year 6.
Yeah, it'll be year 6 because it really started in 2020.
Mm-hmm. So time flies, and yeah, it's always a good time. I'm really looking forward to the week off from work, vacation. We're recording ahead, so we don't have to, worry about making sure a new episode is posted. So it is all just chill vibes, and it's always a good time, especially, we unplug, go out to this cabin, and play games, sip on a little drink, chill in the lake. And yeah, it is very exciting. I did forget to mention that. Also, mainly I think because my brain is elsewhere, I'm just ready to get through tomorrow, and then I'm off for a week. So I'm just trying to make it to that point, y'all.
Yeah, and the next week is going to be a little bit hectic because we have to do 2 episodes early in the week, because we are heading to Trixie Mattel next weekend for her Pink Disco in Nashville. So if you're going, let us know. We hope to see you there. Last year was absolutely amazing. When we were invited to come, I had no idea it was actually going to be to meet DJ Mateo and Trixie Mattel and just hang out with them after the thing. So this year I am better prepared for what's going down. That's why I got me a pink tuxedo for it this year, because if I'm going to be there as a guest, I'm going to look fancy.
Yeah, that also is next week. And then after that, it's Pride Month, y'all, I think. Yeah, next week's the last week of May.
Yes, it is. That means a Patreon episode has to come out next week, as well as a regular episode. So be ready. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you're going to get 2 episodes next week. And I'm going to make a promise to you because Jordy keeps going on about what he wants to do for Pride Month. One of the things I want to do for Pride Month is our Patreon people. I want to give you 2 Patreon episodes for Pride, one from me and one from Jordy.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that works. Also, I want to do, like I said, I'm still cooking with the idea for what we're going to do for Pride Month because I think it's going to be hard to top last year when we literally like rediscovered a serial killer on the podcast. But yeah, it's going to be really hectic. Pride is always hectic to begin with because I do want to do all the Pride things, and doing that on top of the podcast and on top of everything else we do, it's a little hectic, but it's really fun, but it's going to make the month fly by. And also, like Brad was saying, Patreon episode comes out next week. And if you guys aren't aware, yes, because I know we have a lot of new listeners, we do have a Patreon where you can get exclusive bonus episodes just for you guys. I'll link it in the show notes.
Ad-free.
Also ad-free for every episode. And yeah, if you just want to support the pod. So yes, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, Jordy just kind of like, I think, went to his happy place and was like, I have no responsibilities. And here comes old Brad to be like, nope, we got plenty of responsibilities.
We do, but
they're going to be fun responsibilities. I'm really excited for next month. Pride was really fun last year. Hopefully, we're planning on going back to Nashville Pride again this year. And, of course, going to hit Knoxville Pride and some of the other Pride events around. So, very excited.
Me too. And maybe we'll try to hit up a new Pride, maybe. Like, there's also Atlanta Pride,
which is
I've heard is crazy.
Always on my father's birthday. And my father is an older gentleman, so I hope that it takes a really, really long time before I ever get to go to an Atlanta Pride.
That's fair. We're not going to go to Atlanta Pride for many, many years.
Yes, I hope.
So
not that I don't love Atlanta. I just love my daddy more.
Period. So with that, let's get into today's case, because I know that's why you guys are here. You know, try to do a little update at the beginning of the episode, but I know 99% of y'all are here for the case. So let's get into it. We're talking about a case that made history because it literally changed the way British law works forever. It's a case of a brutal murder, the messy aftermath, and injustice that follows. And at its core, this is the story of a queer person struggling with life's cruel circumstances. Tale as old as time. Trying to navigate the world the best she knows how. Today, we're going to be talking about the case of Maxwell Confait and how her senseless death led to a nationwide police reform in the UK that is still felt to this day. But despite this monumental impact her murder had, her case is still technically unsolved. And I say technical because we'll get into it later in the episode. It's one of those situations. We've covered several cases like it before. I'm not saying anyone is 100% guilty, but you guys will see that there's a few shady details here and there regarding certain people in this case that will leave a lot of room for side-eye. So let's just jump right into it. And those are the cases that are always the most frustrating for me because it's like, well, here's this and this and this, but they were never convicted, so the case is unsolved. And I'm like, It's the middle of the night on April 22nd, 1972 in Catford, southeast London, when the peacefulness is interrupted by a phone call to the London Fire Brigade at approximately 1:21 a.m. The call was to report a fire that had broken out at a home located at 27 Doggett Road, with firemen rushing to the scene due to the frantic nature going on in the background of the call. So the caller wasn't frantic, but going on, the noise in the background, it sounded like it was crazy. They arrived just minutes later at 1:25 and met with the home's owner, Winston Good, and his wife, Lillian, who directed them towards the source of the fire. Now, firemen got to work putting out the fire, which, to their surprise, wasn't as serious as they thought. Sure, the house was filled with smoke, but the area that was burning was restricted to a single cupboard located in the downstairs hallway that was used by Lillian to store clothes and linen. The fire was able to be easily extinguished, and then they got to work sweeping through the rest of the house, just following protocol, making sure no one else was home, which according to the goods, no one was. Now they walked to the first floor and found a locked door leading to the spare bedroom at the end of the hallway. After receiving no response after pounding on it, firemen broke the door down, and inside they came across a tragic sight. The body of a young woman lying on the bed, partially nude and not breathing. The woman's lips were blue, and their immediate first thought was that she must have died from smoke inhalation. But upon closer inspection, that would be proven not to be the case. Deep bruises and marks were found on the woman's neck, and it was clear that there were ligature marks, meaning that she had appeared to be strangled. Police were immediately called to the scene to investigate, and upon arriving, one of the firemen actually tells them that he actually knows the woman. Not by name, but her nickname, Handbag. She was a well-known figure in the neighborhood, and she was given the nickname because she was always seen walking the streets carrying one. Now, the goods were able to give more info on the woman and stated that her name was actually Maxwell Confait, and that she had been renting a room from the couple for the last several weeks. Winston elaborated further that Maxwell was a, quote, his words not mine, a homosexual crossdresser, and also went by Michelle. Now, Michelle was a lodger that had moved into the spare bedroom of the Good home in January of 1972, and according to the Goods, had been a great tenant. As Michelle's body was taken in for an autopsy, the Goods were brought down to the station to give a formal interview and explain what had happened leading up to Michelle's body being found. So right away, we have kind of like a murder mystery because it's a body behind a locked door, a mysterious fire, and already the scene is looking weird. According to Lillian, she was awoken by her husband frantically screaming from the first floor that the house was on fire at around 1 a.m. She woke the kids and got outside immediately as the house had caught fire. Lillian gathered the kids and ran outside with Winston, where she told him to go down to the neighbors and call the fire brigade. Winston stated that he had awoken just minutes before his wife after being startled by a, quote, crackling noise coming from the hallway, which is when he went to check and saw the cupboard on fire. He further stated that he had called out to Michelle and even banged on her door a couple of times to tell her they needed to leave, but he received no response and he just assumed that she was out, which is why he told police no one else was home. Now, Michelle earned a living as a sex worker, and so for her to be gone at odd hours of the night wasn't uncommon, so that kind of made sense. But sadly, Michelle was not out, and instead had been murdered in her own bed with no one in the Good family hearing anything throughout the night. At the crime scene, police found little in the way of physical evidence outside of the fire, nor were there any signs of a struggle, but Michelle's autopsy would reveal that she had been strangled with some sort of cord or rope. She had no food in her stomach, but alcohol was found, although it was noted that none was found in the room with her. And an interesting clue was found upon further inspection, as investigators found the severed cord to a lamp stuffed in the nightstand next to Michelle's bed, and it matched the type of cord that was believed to have been the murder weapon. Now, though sadly, no usable fingerprints were able to be pulled from it, by morning, news of Michelle's murder began to spread throughout the Catford area, with many beginning to grieve the woman that just loved talking with anyone who could hold a conversation, and someone whose life was plagued with challenges as she struggled just to survive day to day. Before we go any further, let's tell you a little bit about what we do know about Michelle. And that's the tragic thing too. We don't know a lot. We know she wasn't really close with her family, and so that's always sad and tragic. And we'll see that her life was struggle after struggle, especially for someone who was gender nonconforming growing up in the literal 50s and 60s. So Michelle was born Maxwell Thomas Berty Confait, and she was born on December 20th, 1945 in Kenya.
That would also explain why her family wasn't around, because Kenya is also a very
conservative country, especially when it comes to not just homosexuality, but quote unquote, for lack of a better term, cross-dressing. And so you can understand that type of dynamic. Now, there's been some debate on whether Michelle was trans or somewhere else on the queer spectrum. She went by both Maxwell and Michelle throughout her life, and alternated between dressing in female-presenting clothing and male-presenting clothing, depending on who she was around. But just to make sure we show as much respect as possible, I will be referring to her as Michelle throughout the episode, just because she was more female presenting than male. And a lot of the times, the word transgender didn't exist back then. That term wasn't created until the 1990s. And so a lot of the times you saw back then, trans people just didn't have the language to describe how they felt. So a lot of them would describe themselves as drag queens or female presenters and stuff like that. And so you have to look at it from modern context and kind of just, piece it together on your own. Now, Michelle spent the first bit of her childhood living with her single mother in Kenya before the family immigrated to England in 1963. Once in England, Michelle began to realize that she was attracted to men, and as she became a teenager, she began having sexual relationships with older men in the area and began to wear dresses and makeup. Now, we don't know much about Michelle's early life, but we can assume from the details that we do know that it wasn't all good. In 1969, Michelle was hospitalized after a suicide attempt, but thankfully made a full recovery. Following this, she began to struggle financially, and she turned to sex work in order to survive, often working the West End in London after the gay bars and clubs let out. This led to her being arrested and convicted on 3 separate occasions within the year for prostitution. But despite this, Michelle soon earned a reputation for herself as being a staple in the community, and many locals began to recognize her and looked forward to seeing her. And I think every community has those locals you see every time you go out, go downtown, and it's the same here. Like, oh, hey, I love seeing them. And although they didn't know her real name, Michelle was known to carry a large and extravagant handbag wherever she went, and this caused the locals to start calling her Handbag. But what the locals didn't know, however, was Michelle's struggles with homelessness, as every night was a fight to find somewhere safe to rest. But things seemed to be looking up in late 1971 when Michelle would meet a man named Winston Good one night at the Black Bull Bar in Lewisham. I hope I pronounced that right, which was a popular gay hangout spot at the time. Winston was a steelworker and migrant from Jamaica and had moved to London to start a better life for his family, including his wife Lillian and their 5 children. Michelle and Winston became instant best friends and began to hang out more and more at the bar each night. Now, Winston was openly bisexual during this time, a fact that was known to his wife. But even if she was aware of her husband's sexuality, things weren't going so hot between Winston and Lillian, and by the time he met Michelle, the two were separated but still living together for the kids. Following his separation, Winston began spending more and more time out at the gay bars getting drunk. Now, eventually, Winston also began experimenting with his gender identity, and he also began dressing in female-presenting clothing. With help from Michelle, he began to go out to the bars with her, dressed and identifying as a woman. The two would grow popular with the other bargoers and eventually form their own small group, again, for lack of a better term, quote, cross-dressers. Learning of Michelle's struggles with homelessness, Winston offered her the spare bedroom in his family's home, and she kindly accepted. And so that's also a really unique angle here. This feels like a fact that should be like the shocking secret that I tell you later on in the episode, where it's like, oh, he was secretly loved wearing women's clothing and he was secretly bisexual, and 9 times out of 10 you can be like, oh, well, that's why he's a suspect. But actually, and this time it was well known to their friends, to Lillian, his wife, and so that's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, at first when you started in with the story and he had a wife and kids, I was like, this is going to be one of those where he has a side piece, and then the next thing you know, it's like, I'm going to tell everybody if you don't choose, and that usually does not end very well. Not on this podcast, at least.
It doesn't, and yes, normally that's how you'd think this story would go, but surprise. But before Michelle could move in, she would once again be arrested for her sex work and would spend the next several months in jail after being convicted. When she was released in January of 1972, she promptly went to Winston's and took him up on his offer. Michelle was given the room at the end of the hall on the first floor. Lillian and the kids lived in rooms on the second and third floors of the home, while Winston lived in the front room of the first floor, as, of course, two were separated. And for the next several months, the arrangement seemed to work for everyone. Lillian and the kids interacted with Michelle during dinner and downtime in the living room. They all loved her. But other than that, she stated that it was mainly Winston and Michelle hanging out together, and everyone just kind of did their own thing. So again, best case scenario, wife's like, yeah, Michelle was great. She did her thing. She paid her rent on time, all that, so she's good. Michelle was even allowed to conduct some of her sex work and was known to bring back men on occasions to do the deed in her room, all without issue, which safer that way. She's around people, she has witnesses. But was it possible that this is what occurred on the night of April 22nd? Did Michelle bring back the wrong guy who murdered her before escaping from the house? At face value, this theory seems to hold a lot of weight, but investigators aren't so sure that this is what happened, and instead begin to focus their initial attention on someone else, Winston Good.
That's where I would be looking.
Now, right away, investigators had their eyes on Winston, not just because of his relationship with Michelle, but for several other concerning things that had been uncovered. First of all, was what had happened on the night of the fire, and when Michelle's body was found. Lillian stated that she had been awoken by her husband, who was frantically telling her that there was a fire and she needed to get the kids and get out. Right away, Lillian found it odd that Winston's reaction was so, quote, over the top, considering the fire was relatively small from what she saw. On top of that, Winston stated that he had only woken up a few minutes prior before he alerted his wife, but Lillian noted that she found it odd that Winston was fully dressed in street clothes when he came and woke her up. On top of this, when she instructed him to go call the fire brigade, Winston walked past multiple phone booths without using a single one. His next-door neighbor, who had heard the commotion, followed him and found him in a phone booth almost half a mile away, but yet he had still not contacted anyone.
It's almost like he wants to give time for that fire to really get going.
Maybe. It would,
Especially, if the fire was in a cupboard on
Yeah.
fire, I think I would try to put the fire out first thing. Even before, if I went to wake people up, if it was just in a cupboard.
True.
I mean, unless it's a really big cupboard. It could be a really big cupboard.
Well, according to Lillian, it was not.
Okay, then put the fire out unless you want the house to burn down.
And that's one reason investigators gave him the side eye. So it would actually be the neighbor who ended up calling the police. To add to Winston's strange behavior, the crime scene was also odd. Investigators believe that Michelle was strangled with the severed cord of a lamp found in the nightstand next to her body. While searching the house even further, investigators found the lamp that the cord belonged to stuffed in a cupboard underneath the stairs behind piles of clothes. On top of this, it was discovered that the fire in the hallway cupboard had been set intentionally and that it was caused by someone pouring gasoline into a set of towels and lighting them. And the gasoline was discovered to be from an old heater located down the hall from the cupboard that had not been in working condition for quite some time.
It's like the killer knew a lot what was going on in this house, where to look for things. And also, I'm sure if Michelle had like a John over, first thing she would probably say is, hey, there's other people in this house just in case you try anything. And so this person seemed pretty confident to just walk around this house and hide a lamp in a place that most likely someone living in the house would hide the lamp, and then go and get gasoline out of an old stove. Yeah, right now, Winston's my man.
Yeah, meaning everything the killer used, from the probable murder weapon to everything he used to start the fire, was already inside the home. Which, if this was a random act of violence from a violent John, would be extremely ballsy to do. Investigators also started to look into Winston and Michelle's mutual friends and discovered that things may not have been all hunky-dory between the two. They discovered that in the months since Michelle moved in with Winston, their relationship began to kind of fizzle out as they spent more and more time together. Friends of the two stated that it was very clear Winston was very jealous of the attention Michelle got, especially when the two would go out dressed as women together. Michelle would also begin to resent Winston as people began to accuse her of being his, quote, rented lover. Michelle also began to sleep with mutual friends of theirs, which apparently angered Winston. And investigators also believe that it's very possible that the two had a sexual relationship together, something their friends also suspected but couldn't confirm. Investigators brought Winston in for questioning and asked him directly about his relationship with Michelle. Winston admitted that he was interested in her sexually and that he would often get jealous of the attention she got, but that nothing ever happened between the two. Winston would be grilled intensely over the course of 2 days, with the lead investigator on the case concluding that Winston was, quote, a deeply weak-willed man that would be pressured/admit to the murder even if he didn't do it, given enough pressure. What a way to be described by people, being like, yeah, he was a weak-willed man.
But I'm guessing since this case isn't solved, that man was wrong.
Well, let's find out. Because following this, they began to look elsewhere on the possibility that maybe it wasn't Winston. And shockingly, they wouldn't have to look far before a new suspect would fall into their laps. 2 days after Michelle was discovered murdered, multiple other fires were reported in the same area of Catford. Small fires that were intentionally started and seemed to match exactly with what happened in the Good home. One of the fires was set inside an abandoned home just a few doors down from where Michelle was murdered, actually. So this kind of gave it a little credence. On April 24th, an officer spotted a young man in the Catford area acting suspiciously and confronted him. The boy was an 18-year-old named Colin Lattimore, someone known to police for previous run-ins for petty crimes. The officer took Colin back to his grandmother's house where he found 2 other young men, 15-year-old Ronnie Leighton and 14-year-old Ahmet Salih. Colin admitted that he was the one who set the fires along with the help of Ronnie and Ahmet. Realizing the similarities, though, between the fires and Michelle's murder, the officer arrested all 3 boys and took them down to the station for questioning. And this would be the last time the families of any of the boys would hear from them until the following morning. No one contacted them or told them anything or even where the boys were. They were literally snatched off the street.
And there's only one of them that's an adult.
Yes, well, and one is 14, just turned 14.
And the other's 15. It's not like they're much more mature.
But by the next morning, investigators announced to the public that Colin Lattimore had made a full confession, admitting to setting the fire inside the Good home and murdering Maxwell Confait with the help of Ronnie and Ahmet. Not only did they confess, but they had signed written confessions detailing what had happened. I mean, that sounds pretty legit at face value.
Actually, it really doesn't. This sounds like a coerced confession to me, right off the bat.
And you know, hindsight is 2020, and yeah, it's going to start sounding a little fishy.
Well, I mean, they take children and one 18-year-old in and keep them all night in police custody and don't tell anybody. And then the next day, they've all confessed. Yeah, I would say forced confession, especially back in this time period.
Yeah, and you're about to see it's going to get a lot worse.
Oh, I have a feeling it will.
Also, just a random side note, if you guys hear thunder in the background, we were recording this in the middle of one of the, like, supposed to be worst thunderstorms in East Tennessee. So, yeah, if you...
I'll take care of that.
He will, but also, I'm like, it kind of adds to the ambience because, you know, we're telling a very whodunit murder case. So now, this news came as a shock to the whole community, as the fact that 3 teenage boys were being accused of such a brutal murder was completely out of left field. But despite the initial reaction, all 3 confessed and signed confessions, so that seemed like an open and shut case. But of course, things are never that simple, and right away the families of the 3 boys had a lot of questions and were outraged at what they said was a, quote, a blatant miscarriage of justice, as all 3 boys were subjected to police brutality. For starters, all 3 were held in jail and interrogated for hours without their parents or a lawyer present. All 3 stated later that they were physically assaulted and verbally threatened by Detective Peter Woolidge until they confessed to setting the fire inside the Good home. Following this, they were handed over to the detectives overseeing the Michelle murder and interrogated for a further 4 hours until detectives obtained the written confessions of all 3. But the thing the boys' family stated police never took into consideration was the fact that the supposed ringleader of the 3, Colin Lattimore, the 18-year-old, struggled with severe mental and learning disabilities, and despite being 18, had the mental capacity of an 8-year-old.
That is even worse.
So all underage people. On top of that, Ronnie Leighton also struggled with mental delayment and was in and out of care for most of his childhood. Ahmet Salih had just turned 14 by this point and had just immigrated from Turkey just a few years before, and he was also struggling to adjust to England. So all 3 had their own struggles. All 3 were underage, Colin mentally, And all three, though, did have previous run-ins with police at various points in the months before the murder, but it was always for like very petty teenage crimes, vandalism, petty theft, stuff like that. It was never anything involving other people or violent crime or even drugs or anything like that. All three lived in close proximity to the Good home, but no one was ever able to establish that any of the three boys even knew Michelle or had any sort of interaction with her. But despite this, investigators stated they were confident in the confessions, and all three boys were arrested for Michelle's murder despite no physical evidence.
Well, I mean, a confession will get you there. This is just me saying this outside of actually going through it, but the police would have to almost kill me. And I don't think I could confess, because I think a fate worse than death is going to jail, going to prison for the rest of your life, especially. So they could bring out the rubber hose if they wanted to and beat me all they wanted. I'd let them kill me before I confessed and went to jail.
And again, y'all, do not say a word to police without a lawyer present. I don't care how much they threaten you or how much they say, well, we have this and this on you. If they had it on you, you would be arrested. They are bullshitting you. Sorry, we just paused because the lights are flickering, and I don't know if it's from the storm or ghosts. Most likely the storm. We'll see if we have to stop the podcast and record tomorrow. Hopefully not. We're going to try and power through it. We're almost there. But yeah, do not know your rights. Do not talk to police without a lawyer present. And unless they say you're under arrest, leave. And that's my law advice to you. So just 3 days after Michelle's murder, the case was declared officially closed by the local PD, and soon began the process of putting the three teen boys accused of her murder on trial with no physical evidence, only the confession of the boys and the written statement, which turned out to be given by Colin Lattimore, who, by the way, had that severe learning disability that made him unable to read or write. So that left everyone who knew him wondering how on earth he supposedly wrote out a full confession. Without any lawyer or his parents there could be no confirmation for anything other than by the statements given by investigators. And that's the thing too. Investigators lie, cops lie, everybody lies, everyone's a human being. And so I'm not saying it's everyone, but a lot of them will lie on you to try to make you feel guilty, especially if it's one that's got tunnel vision. So just don't talk to cops without a lawyer. Now, a preliminary trial was held just a week later with the lawyers of all three boys trying to get the charges thrown out due to everything I just explained. The defense laid out the lack of evidence against any of the boys, as well as walked through the timeline of events surrounding Michelle's murder and the whereabouts of the boys, who by this point began getting referred to in the press as the Catford Three. So this is where a huge point of contention was brought up in how Michelle's murder was handled by investigators, mainly in the fact that it was never able to be scientifically proven when Michelle actually died. And that was a huge factor on who possibly murdered her. Because, again, we've covered cases like this before. Time of death is extremely important because it narrows down the window of who could have done it very much. So let's kind of go back and walk through the last day of Michelle's life and the movements of the Catford Three around this time. So to start off, the original police report and autopsy listed Michelle's time of death of most likely being sometime late in the evening of April 21st or in the early morning hours of the 22nd. Techs at the scene, however, failed to perform a rectal temperature check on Michelle's body to get a much more accurate guess of her time of death because they were told not to by the lead investigator, who stated that Michelle was, quote, a known homosexual, and he didn't want to risk destroying any possible evidence of recent sexual activity. Failing to do this opened up the window of the time of death by quite a large margin and made it more difficult to pinpoint an exact possible killer. But even with this uncertainty, investigators concluded that it would have had to have occurred on the 21st or the 22nd. Both days, all three boys had solid alibis with multiple witnesses to back them up. Throughout the day and into the night of the 21st, Colin would spend it at the Salvation Army Youth Center along with his brother before both returned home together. Ronald and Ahmet would spend the day hanging out at Ahmet's house alongside his younger sister and her friend. The group hung out together until around 2 a.m. when Ahmet and Ronald decided to leave to head to Ronald's house. But instead of going straight to Ronald's house, the two decided to go and rob a local shoe shop about a mile away from the murder scene, which, not the smartest move, Both boys would be arrested at the shoe shop at around 2 a.m., almost the exact time that the responders were discovering Michelle's body, but would be released into the custody of their parents at 4 that morning. Following this, the boys would meet with Colin on Monday the 24th, and that is when the trio would go around and began setting fires in various areas around the neighborhood, leading to cops being called and the boys being picked up. At no point in the timeline of events were any of the boys alone, nor did any of them have enough time to cover as much ground as they did if they were murdering Michelle, during the time investigators stated they were. On top of this, the defense argued what possible motive the boys would have to even be in the house to murder her to begin with, as none were known to have any interaction with her. The prosecution, however, argued that it was likely, since Michelle was a sex worker, that she propositioned one or all of the boys, and that enraged them. And again, we're going back to all the boys are underage, like I was saying, going back to the kind of
And blame the victim.
blame the victim, and also queer people are predators to young boys type thing. So they're like, oh, well, she was a sex worker, so she was probably out there trying to have sex with minors, causing them to follow her back to her house and murder her before setting the fire. Now, this theory is based on literally no sort of evidence other than the prosecution's own prejudice and the fact that they just made it up. And that's the thing, though, too, is like, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. You have to prove that. Like, what is your evidence for this? Besides just pulling it out of your own ass. Now, despite the lack of evidence and the boys' solid alibi, the judge declined to drop the charges, and instead Colin and Ronald were both charged with first-degree murder, while Ahmet had the murder charges dropped for some reason and was only charged with arson. Ahmet was released on bail pending his trial, but bond was withheld from Colin and Ronnie, and both were kept at the Ashford Remand Center until their trial. Sadly, during this time, the case caused little in the way of public outcry, with Michelle herself being rarely reported on by name, save for a few mentions of a, quote, murdered cross-dresser. The case would go to trial in November of 1972, and after several weeks, a verdict was reached on November 24th, 1972. Despite everything I just went over being presented in court, Ronald Leighton was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Colin would be found guilty of manslaughter due to, quote, diminished responsibility due to his learning disability, and he was sentenced to be confined to the Rampton Mental Health Hospital for life. Ahmet would also be found guilty of arson, and he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. In his closing statements to the court, the judge overseeing the case stated, quote, Maxwell Confait was an odd creature, and indeed it may be your view that he was no great loss to the world. But justice was served. And it's like, who the hell says that? And again, I think this goes back to showing the prejudice, the homophobia, the transphobia. And honestly, that the biggest surprise for me when researching this case was the fact that they put so much effort into solving Michelle's murder. Because honestly, 9 times out of 10, they're just like, well, at least here in America during this time, it was, oh, it's just a random act of violence. It was just a gay lover's quarrel. You know, case closed, let's just move on.
They really haven't put a lot of effort into this. They basically talked to like 4 people, one of them that had possible motive to do it if him and Michelle was fighting and he was jealous and everything like that. And then you have 3 boys that just happened to set fires at the wrong time, I think.
So what may be obvious to some of you, especially those of you who watch us on YouTube, we are in completely different states of dress. And that was because the last night when we were recording it in the middle of a severe thunderstorm. And we even joked about it earlier in the episode, like, you know, if we don't make it, that's what happened to us. Right in the middle of recording, the lights started flickering. Everything started going on and off. It was like poltergeist up in here. And then finally, everything just went black. And that's when we heard the full extent of the hellscape that was going on outside.
There was a tornado not very far from where we're recording.
Yeah, tornadoes touched down. The wind was crazy. It was blowing sideways. The lightning was weird. It was like a lightning storm, and it was nonstop all night.
I've never seen a lightning storm like that in my entire life. It never stopped. It literally looked like a strobe light going on and off constantly. The front of the house is like windows, so the power went off, And like any good redneck does, I laid on the couch and just watched the storm, and I actually got a feeling like, uh-oh, this one might be something dangerous. And turns out it was. Like, tornado not very far from here. Luckily, it didn't get us. But yeah, I've never seen lightning or a storm like that in my entire life.
So yeah, needless to say, it was a pretty eventful night, but power went out, and so we had to pause until currently the next day to record and finish recording the episode. So just a funny little thing that happened. And things, that's showbiz, baby. Things happen like that. But picking up where we left off, I'm pretty sure we left off describing what the judge said about how he described Michelle as possibly being no great loss to the world. And also talking about how all three boys were convicted. And even though there was someone else who had more motive, it just so happened that the boys were setting fires at the wrong, very, very wrong time. And sadly, that worked out in the real killer's advantage. So the boys would appeal their sentence in January of 1973, but it was immediately denied. Colin Lattimore's father began working around the clock, proclaiming the injustice towards his son and the other boys, and began to call and write to every official he could find, begging for their help, just in reopening the case. This included the Prime Minister and the Queen. Sadly, his pleas fell on deaf ears, and for the next year, there was no progress on getting the case reopened, and honestly, hope was starting to fade fast. But, starting in 1974, renewed hope was found when the general election of 1974 was held, and two new members were brought into the House, Roy Jenkins and Alex Line, two members of the Liberal Party who had built strong careers advocating for and reviewing cases where wrongful convictions were highly suspected. Following their election, both wanted to work towards putting their money where their mouth was and began reviewing cases, with the case of the Catford Three being at the top of their list. Now, with the help of Jenkins and Line, they worked to bring in one of the top pathologists in the country, a professor named Donald Tier. They even worked on a television special reviewing the case to be made, and it aired in November of '74, with Dr. Tier stating that after reviewing the case, he was confident that Michelle's time of death was closer to 6 or 6:30 p.m. on the evening of the 21st, meaning it was physically impossible for any of the boys to have committed the murder. Now, following this report, the Chief Justice at the time announced that the case had met the criteria to be referred back to the Court of Appeals, and with that, they announced that they were throwing out all the charges against the boys and that all would be released immediately. Best case scenario, I think the last case I covered, Kathy Woods was the last case I covered. It took 35 years for justice to be served and for her wrongful conviction to be overturned. So it's still sad when it happens, but thankfully they only served about a little over a year before they were finally released, because there are so many cases where it's literal decades before they were freed.
Or they never get free.
Or they never get free, and that just makes me sick to my stomach. Now, the judge overseeing the appeal would state that, quote, "This was a gross miscarriage of justice and all three boys are innocent." He ended his statement by criticizing how police handled the original case and steamrolled all the young boys. He also ordered that Michelle's murder case be reopened and investigated, and an investigation be opened into how police handled their investigation of the Catford Three and the procedures and protocols when it comes to interrogating suspects who are underage. Now, an investigation into the police was oversaw by Sir Harry Fisher, who determined that he found the boys' claims of police brutality to be, quote, dubious at best, and that the police had no choice but to close down the investigation after the boys confessed, and claiming that the boys' interrogation was fair game, even if their parents or lawyers weren't present. He also ended it by stating that while he believes Colin was innocent of the murder, he firmly believes that Ronald and Ahmet are guilty, and that despite being exonerated, it doesn't mean they didn't do it. But despite this, he did reprimand the police's procedures as well as the pathologist, stating that both were grossly mishandled in the initial hours after the murder. Following Fisher's reports, officials and members of Parliament began meeting to discuss what changes needed to be made in order to prevent something like this from happening in the future. So from 78 to 1981, over 50 meetings were held in Parliament, led by a group called the, quote, Royal Commission on Criminal Procedure. The group's aim was to streamline the various avenues police had to go through to investigate crimes into one single cohesive entity for more concise and clear investigations. The group also examined what rights and actions police can take when investigating a suspect, as well as what rights suspects have in these situations, and how all should be handled in the criminal system. In describing this, it was said, quote, both the police and the suspect are hampered by this state of affairs. The police, because they may be obliged to operate in areas of doubtful or ambiguous legal authority, and the suspect, because his rights at any particular moment may be so unclear that he lacks any proper or practical legal protection, which, fair. Following years of work with the committee, change was finally made starting in 1984 when the Peace and Evidence Act of 1984 was passed, followed closely behind by the Prosecution of Defense Act of 1985. Both acts now provide clear and concise rules and protocols police must follow when investigating crimes, as well as certain automatic rights suspects have. These have been in place since and continue to be used to this day to better handle how cases are investigated in Britain. So that's where they literally changed British law forever because of the domino effect caused by Michelle's case, which led to the Catford Three case. It did lead to actual change being made across the whole country to better make sure things are handled better and not so sloppy, and innocent people are less likely to go to jail. But despite her case causing such an upheaval in this way, across the entire country, Michelle's murder was still unsolved, and investigators were no closer to solving it than they were almost a decade prior. No new evidence, no new suspects, and no new hope of finally bringing her justice. That is, until February 20th, 1980, when the current investigators on the case announced to the public that they were confident they knew exactly who murdered Michelle.
I'm thinking it's not going to be who we think it is.
That day, Detective E.J. George submitted a report to the public prosecutor alleging that Michelle's killer was actually a man named Douglas Franklin, and that the murder had been even witnessed by a third party also present at the scene, a man named Paul Pooley. He elaborated that just a few years after the murder, Paul had made a jailhouse confession to his cellmate in which he stated he had watched Douglas murder someone in their own bedroom back in 1972. Detective E.J. went and paid a visit to Paul, who further elaborated on what happened, and it was revealed that after Michelle was last arrested in 1970, she was held at the Wormwood prison where Douglas Franklin was also imprisoned at the time. According to Paul, Douglas and Michelle became lovers, and Douglas protected Michelle until her release. After the two were released, they allegedly continued their love affair, and Paul had hung out with the two on several occasions. On the night of the murder, Paul was present with Douglas and Michelle in her room at the Good House. According to him, Doug and Michelle were dancing around the room, laughing, and everything seemed to be going fine. The two started to argue, however, and Doug pushed Michelle on the bed and began to strangle her right in front of Paul before the two fled. Now, two interesting points to note he made, however, was that neither he nor Doug set any fire inside the house, and that Michelle had been dead for several days prior to her body being discovered, which, that was a lot off, much more than was originally suspected. So, of course, you have to investigate that. And how do you explain? There's a big difference between being dead for possibly 1 to 2 days to several days.
Yeah, I was going to say that expert isn't great if he can't tell the difference between 1 and 6 days.
Well, the detective further explained in his report that every previous estimated time of death was wrong, and that Michelle had actually been dead for several days before she was found. His evidence included the report of one of the firefighters who initially discovered the body, who stated that rigor mortis had already set in by the time they found her. Two pathologists were also brought in and reviewed the original autopsy and discovered that several of Michelle's organs were discolored, which often happens when someone has been dead for a while. With this and other undisclosed evidence, they concluded that Michelle had actually been murdered 48 hours to 72 hours before her body was discovered.
That's a big difference.
Now, that is a huge jump in time frame compared to a mere few hours. But upon further investigation, it would be discovered that there might be some plausibility and credibility. In their initial statements to police, both Winston and Lillian stated that the last time they actually saw Michelle was on the 19th. So puts it around the time frame. Lillian stated that she saw Michelle enter her room in the company of a white man. Although she didn't know his name, she had seen Michelle with him on several occasions prior. Following this, neither reported seeing or hearing from Michelle until her body was discovered on the 22nd. Now, investigators went to interview Douglas, and he denied even knowing Michelle. And when investigators went to interview him a second time to clarify some things, they discovered that Douglas had killed himself in his cell, taking any secrets he may have to the grave. So, again, not 100% concrete like he did it, but at the same time, it does lend some credibility. It kind of fits with their narrative of she was possibly killed by an angry John or a jilted lover. That's also why they suspected Winston, partially because they suspected that he more than likely had a sexual relationship with her. He admitted to being sexually attracted to her. So it's one of those things. Now, sadly, that would prove to be the end of that lead, as there was no evidence or other avenues to investigate it. Officials then turned their sights back to another major suspect that was somewhat overlooked in the initial investigation, which, reminder, lasted all of 3 days, Winston Good. But an interview with him could never happen. On April 27th, 1972, just a few days after Michelle's murder, Winston was found wandering the street in a dazed and confused state, partially nude. He was taken in for observation but released shortly after, and he would end up taking his own life by ingesting cyanide in May of 1972. Again, taking any secrets he had with him. And following this, the case of Michelle Confait's murder kind of went cold. No new leads or developments have been made, and sadly it doesn't seem like there ever will be, considering over 50 years have passed. But you know what they say never, and until that moment, we can remember the person Michelle Confait was according to her friends, and that was a kind and caring person who loved life despite everything it put her through. And sadly, that is the case of Michelle Confait and the murder that changed British law forever. And it's one of those frustrating things because, first there was like, well, Winston seems like the number one suspect. But then you have Douglas Franklin, and then you have one theory put forth by investigators today. They were like, it's also possible Douglas was the one who murdered Michelle, and then Winston was the one who set the fire. For one reason or the other, they described him as weak-willed. They thought maybe he panicked, and this was his way to kind of like cover it up, like, oh, I discovered her because there's a fire. People do weird things in situations, and so that's a possible theory. Maybe Winston killed her, maybe Douglas killed her, maybe neither of them killed her. And that's one of those frustrating things where it's like you have all these pieces of the puzzle, but none of them fit correctly, and it's like you're missing the single piece that would bring them all together. And even though over 50 years have passed, cases that are over 100 years old are still being solved to this day. So I always have hope, and I hope one day that Michelle's case gets solved.
Yeah, it was a sad end for a lot of people in that one.
It was a very sad end, and I can't honestly tell you much about what happened to the Catford Three. They were released. They stayed released. They were never in jail again, but they kind of kept low profiles and just went on with their lives, thankfully, the best they could, especially after something like this, being found guilty of a murder you did not commit. So, yeah, this story has all the makings of a tragedy, wrongful convictions, a queer person who struggled in life, but despite all of it, maintained a positive attitude and just tried to make the best of what she had. And in the end, sadly, hopefully justice will be served. And with that, thank you guys again so much for tuning in for another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast, and of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until Monday, stay safe and stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.